He had failed to call for nearly a year. That alone should have provided me with a clue. However, when the phone rang on Thursday afternoon and Darren's name appeared on the screen, I experienced a sensation that I had not experienced in some time, a surge that caused my chest to rise briefly before I could say greeting. He stated that they were organizing a small birthday celebration for Emily, my granddaughter, and that they would appreciate it if I attended. He spoke of it as if it were a common occurrence, as if we had not spent the past few years circling silence. He even made a jest about the fact that I should bring the sugar cookies I used to bake, which had cinnamon glaze and fractured edges. The world was softened by the gentle rain that fell outside. I recall that because I remained by the window for an entire minute after we parted ways, merely holding the phone, I assured myself that this marked the starting point of a new endeavor. That is, it is possible that time ultimately resolved the situation. It is possible that motherhood was not always a losing endeavor. That night, I proceeded with caution when packing. I removed the navy dress that I had reserved for special occasions, pressed it myself, slipped in a hand-knitted scarf for Emily, and inserted an old photograph of Darren and me when he was still wearing braces and enjoyed holding my hand in public. That particular item was concealed within the interior of my purse, not to be given, rather to be recollected. There is something peculiar about preparing for a journey. You do not act hastily. You are in contact with everything. You are curious about the sensation of a vacant home for a few days. You apply less force when closing the refrigerator door. Water the vegetation at a reduced rate. I was unable to obtain adequate slumber that evening, not out of anxiety, but rather out of optimism. It had been an extended period since I had anticipated an event that was not associated with a pharmacy discount or a novel soup recipe. Friday morning arrived. I stood by the door, verifying the time once more, 8:13, while holding my suitcase upright and wearing my parka. Darren stated that he would visit at approximately 8 o'clock. It is amusing how 5 minutes can seem like 50 when you are anticipating the arrival of someone you care about. He arrived just prior to 8:30. Windows descended. The volume of the music is excessive for the early hours of the morning. He smiled as if everything was in order, as if this was the way it had always been. And I, too, grinned, as that is what mothers do. They continue to smile even when they are uncertain about the next step. They depart. Take a break. If you have ever packed more faith than clothes for an excursion, you understand my sentiment. He halted in close proximity to the train station's side entrance. The air maintained the tranquility of early morning, despite the fact that the sky was already illuminated. There is no traffic. There is no need for urgency. The only sound is the subdued murmur of birds and the occasional passing vehicle. The trunk was opened by Darren, who stooped over. The abrupt movement caused a faint sting in my legs as I stepped outside. He refrained from venturing outside with me. Rather, he remained in the driver's seat, his fingertips striking the steering wheel as if he had a more pressing obligation. I retrieved the suitcase and lifted it to the curb. He rolled down the window and stated that he had already acquired the ticket. I was instructed to enter the building and await further instructions. The train is scheduled to arrive shortly. Said that he needed to perform a short errand, buy coffee before coming home. There is an issue with the new caterers organization. At that time, he beamed at me. Insufficiently broad, not flexible. A mere flicker, akin to an individual briefly activating a light before promptly turning it off. He accelerated and accelerated away before I could utter a single word. Please refrain from hugging. There is no turning back. The street is illuminated solely by the tail lights, which gradually fade. Walking into the diminutive station, I drew the suitcase closer. It was antiquated, having not been significantly updated since the 1970s. The vinyl seats are secured to the floor with bolts. In the corner, there are 2 vending devices that are in operation. A wall clock that chimed at an excessively high volume. I located the ticket counter and provided my identity. The woman behind the glass typed something, frowned, and then shook her head. She inquired as to whether I was certain that it had been acquired today. I nodded. She reevaluated the situation and concluded that there was no reservation associated with that name. I examined my handbag. There is no paper ticket. There was no confirmation via email. The battery of my phone was at a mere 3%. I did not observe a charger in my luggage. I sat down near the window, my suitcase erect beside me, and awaited. 5 minutes, then 10. Afterward, 30. No contact. There is no notification. No Darren. I endeavored to prevent my thoughts from becoming disorganized. I reminded myself that he was preoccupied. It is feasible that he encountered an obstruction. It is possible that the ticket will be delivered in the near future. It is possible that there was a simple error at the counter. Another hour has passed. I stood up and took a walk outside, anticipating the possibility of observing the vehicle returning. However, there was no one on the curb. There was no silver SUV that was familiar. A stray dog was observed pacing across the lot while an elderly man purchased a newspaper from the stand. I returned to the interior. This time, the couches were more difficult. Louder was the silence. I sat down, tightened my coat, and gazed at the identical timepiece. The second hand maintained a consistent and fluid motion, as if it had no other destination, in contrast to the individual who was intended to be present. I was unaware that I was no longer a passenger. I was the only one who was left behind. I maintained my position for as long as I was able. I stood and paced the small terminal for an additional hour. The clerk behind the glass cast a sideways gaze at me, but she refrained from uttering a word. No one did. I was merely another elderly woman who was anticipating an event that no one else comprehended. I attempted to contact Darren once more. This time it chimed once before proceeding directly to voicemail. Unfortunately, I neglected to leave a message. I felt a tightness in my larynx as I spoke. I did not have confidence in its ability to convey tranquility. I exited the building. The atmosphere had become sharper. Clouds are beginning to form in the vicinity of the horizon. As if Darren might abruptly appear as a poor magic trick, I once again searched the lot, even checking the rear of the building. However, there was no indication of his presence. There is not a single indication of the vehicle. I proceeded to the curb in anticipation of a taxi or potentially a rideshare. The screen of my phone was now completely black. The battery has been depleted. I have no battery. There is no reserve. I am alone, except for the gentle murmur of the wind. I signaled to a woman who appeared to be amiable. I inquired whether it would be possible to borrow her phone for a brief conversation. She hesitated before relinquishing it. I contacted Darren once more, a single chime followed by a rapid clack. He had declined it. I returned the phone to her and expressed my gratitude. She did not pose any inquiries, rather she simply nodded and proceeded to depart. The bench was noticeably more rigid upon returning indoors. I examined each compartment twice after opening my purse. I discovered a folded $10 bill adjacent to a package of tissues. That was the entirety of my funds. I had neglected to prepare, anticipating that I would require funds. It was not intended for me to travel independently. I examined the room. A young male was wearing headphones, a woman with 2 children who are sleeping on her couch. No one was observing me. That may have been more painful than if they had. At least then I would be considered existing in the eyes of someone. Quiet and still, I sat with my hands folded in my lap. The second hand remained unmoved and unaffected as the clock continued to strike. A gentle voice emerged. "Your appearance suggests that you would benefit from a bit of warmth." I raised my head. A to-go cup was in the hands of an elderly woman who was approximately my age. She had kind eyes and donned a denim jacket with a frayed neckline. She introduced herself as Ruthie, said that her bookshop was located across the street. It was unremarkable, only paperbacks and subpar coffee, but it was warm. He stated that I could rest for a short period of time if I desired. The strain is off. I nodded. I lacked the stamina to decline. We proceeded cautiously across the street. The wheels of my suitcase became entangled in the crevices of the sidewalk. Ruthie observed and adjusted her cadence to correspond with my own. She did not engage in conversation after that. Instead, she directed me to an antique armchair situated near the window and guided me through the shop's entrance. She refrained from inquiring about the circumstances. She simply permitted me to remain seated. For the first time that day, I allowed myself to cease feigning well-being. The store had a faint toasted aroma and the scent of ancient pages. There is nothing pleasant or comforting about this. It is more akin to dust and overbrewed tea. The silence was tranquil, but it was not the kind that caused discomfort. The one that has settled around you has allowed you to breathe. Ruthie proceeded behind the counter without uttering a word. She activated a compact electric teapot and extracted 2 glasses with chips from a shelf. Her hands were not shaky despite the fact that they moved slowly. Age alone, consistent and lived in. I sat in the armchair located near the front window. It was profoundly low, the type of experience that compels your vertebrae to relax. I am currently wearing my outerwear and holding my purse in my lap. My movements were minimal. I was not prepared to do so. Ruthie served me a cup of tea. There will be no inquiries or idle conversation. The quiet benevolence of an individual who had evidently been in the same situation before. We remained in that position for an extended period. I observed automobiles passing by the exterior. The joy of a group of adolescents was so far away from my seat that it felt as though they were in a different country as they laughed noisily as they passed. I consumed the tea in small quantities. It was acrid, the type of bitterness that can become ingrained in your system if you allow it. Ruthie eventually expressed her thoughts. She asserted that she had been in charge of the establishment for nearly 3 decades. She maintained it open despite the fact that people no longer read as much as they used to. There is something about the weight of literature that anchored her in a way that nothing else could. I nodded. That was comprehended by me. The books you possess can serve as a gauge for the duration of your life. She did not inquire about my identity. I was not questioned as to my presence. I conversed with the silence as if it were an old friend. She mentioned that she was once left at a transit station in Tulsa, said that it was not equivalent to being forgotten. It was even more detrimental. It was rendered invisible. I gazed downward at my hands. They did not tremble, but they remained clasped, my fingers tightly interlocked around the ceramic mug. I had not shed a tear, not even at the station. However, as I sat in that chair, I felt a slight collapse in my chest as I listened to the gentle groan of the floorboards beneath Ruthie's feet. She approached a book on a back shelf, removed it, and placed it down next to me. Said that I could either read it or simply hold it. Said that occasionally the weight of a narrative was more beneficial than the narrative itself. The cover was soiled, the title dissipated in half. However, the spine remained resilient. I remained seated for an extended period of time. I refrained from opening it. I simply allowed it to rest in my lap, that tiny, substantial object, something that had not abandoned me. The atmosphere outside had become gray by the late afternoon. Ruthie presented me with a blanket and informed me that I was welcome to remain for as long as I required. There is no need for urgency. There is no timepiece. I remained. I slept in a bookshop that night with my coat on, a book that was unopened, and a half-full cup of chilly tea. Additionally, I experienced a greater sense of security than I had in an extended period of time. Someone was turning pages when I awoke the following morning. Ruthie was already at the counter, her spectacles being lowered low on her nose as she read an old and heavy document. The shop appeared to be warmer than it had been the previous evening, or perhaps it was simply my imagination. On a tiny heated plate located behind the counter, she prepared oatmeal. Absence of saccharin, absence of milk, a small quantity of raisins and basic cereals. I ate in silence, taking each morsel at a leisurely pace, allowing the warmth to permeate my chest. She presented me with a clean dish towel and gestured toward the sink after I had completed. That was the manner in which we expressed our gratitude. I informed her that I needed to return home by noon. She did not inquire about the location of that item. I was recently presented with a folded umbrella, a container of water, and 2 granola bars in a paper bag. She stated that she had a sense that the sky was not yet complete. It was not. Midway through the bus journey, the clouds ruptured. The windows were tapped by the rain as if it were aware of something I was not. I occupied a position at the rear of the vehicle with my suitcase resting on the floor between my legs and water collecting beneath the wheels. Upon my return to my residence, everything appeared to be weighing more. I removed my damp outerwear, placed my suitcase by the door, and proceeded directly to the small filing cabinet in my bedroom closet. I wrenched the drawer open, despite the fact that it was slightly caught due to humidity. The documents that Darren likely hoped I had forgotten about were located in the middle folder. The trust account that my late spouse established prior to his initial surgery. Darren and Emily were intended to receive it at some point. However, I continued to serve as the primary trustee. I removed the folder and sat at the dining table, perusing each page. Clear terms were stipulated. My written authorization was required for the release of funds. My spouse insisted on a mental competency clause as a precautionary measure following the events that befell his mother. Independent medical verification was necessary for any assertion of diminished capacity. I was aware of the strategies that Darren had implemented. He talked to me in a manner that was both patronizing and sluggish for months, and I could sense it. The manner in which he verified my statements. How he extended an offer to assist in the management of my correspondence and appointments. Her voice was consistently soothing, yet it concealed a subtle affront. I removed the envelope that was concealed behind the final page. It contained a recent letter from the bank informing Darren that he had submitted a request to commence partial withdrawal. Additionally, he had submitted a letter that was signed in my name, which authorized the release. However, it was not my signature. I gazed at it for an extended period of time. The circles were incorrect. The angle is excessively acute. He had copied it from the birthday cards that I used to send to Emily. He must have believed that I would not observe. I would not even verify that. I refolded the documents, meticulously placed them in a new envelope, and set it aside. He believed that I was losing my footing. However, I kept every detail in mind. Kendrick broke the seal and revealed the contents, particularly this seen before. It was an addendum to the trust that was signed 6 months prior to my husband's passing, a clause that had never been activated. It was stipulated that the trust would be promptly suspended if any beneficiary attempted to manipulate, falsify, or coerce the trustee in any manner. Permanent disqualification is necessary unless it is reinstated by a unanimous vote of 2 named legal advisors, both of whom have since passed away. Kendrick positioned the page in front of me and used his finger to touch the paragraph. This grants us the power to take action. A written notice and evidence are all that is required. I possess the letter you submitted. That suffices. He presented me with a stylus. I executed the document. Calling the financial institution was his action. He maintained a constant, unwavering demeanor, never ebbing or flowing. He cited the section, stated the clause, and designated me as an active trustee with entire control. The account had been frozen by the time he terminated the call. Absence of access. Darren will not be informed until the evaluation is complete. I reclined in the chair and gazed at the framed painting on the wall, which depicted a tranquil forest with gold foliage and a path that faded into a gentle blur. My husband had selected it. He stated that it reminded him of the forests behind his childhood residence. I have never been fond of it, insufficiently silent and uncertain. However, on that particular day, I gained a more comprehensive understanding of the situation. Kendrick replaced the folder in the compartment and secured it. He did not provide any additional information. He escorted me to the door, placed his hand on my shoulder, and awaited my exhalation. I refrained from bidding farewell. I have just exited the building. For the first time in weeks, my steps felt like they belonged to me once more. I did not bother to remove my shoes when I arrived home that afternoon. I immediately proceeded to the kitchen table, where I extracted the envelope from Kendrick and placed it flat beside my notepad. The trust had been suspended by the bank. However, this was insufficient. Not for me. I sat down, activated the antiquated desk lamp, and commenced the composition of a letter. Not to Darren. It had already become silent in that aspect of me. I submitted a letter to the Office of the Inspector General. I enumerated all of the allegations, the false claims, the forged signature, and the attempt to obtain legal assent. I ensured that the dates, names, and institutions were included. I was not interested in drama. Rather, I sought the truth. Quiet and abundant. I have enclosed copies of Kendrick's statement and the forged document. All of the documents were signed in blue ink. I sealed the envelope and placed it in my purse. The air that evening was keen and still, and the post office was only 4 blocks away. This type of air had the ability to awaken one in a manner that coffee could not. The letter was dispatched with confirmation of receipt. Observed the clerk stamp the item and discard it into the canvas receptacle with the same care as if it were not bearing the weight of a family breakup. I maintained my composure. I abruptly turned and exited the building. I retrieved my checkbook by opening the kitchen compartment upon my return home. I had not utilized it in several months. I sat at the table and began writing small checks, one to the retirement fund I had allowed to lapse, one to the heating company to prepay winter service, and one to a local literacy organization I used to volunteer with. However, Darren informed me that I was too fatigued to continue with such activities. Each payment was akin to a modest reclamation, not retribution, rather restoration. Kendrick contacted me 2 days later. Darren had finally contacted me. He desired responses. Kendrick informed him of the truth, the trust was suspended, the documents were under investigation, and there would be no access, payout, or any further silent larceny. Darren did not contact me. He neglected to leave a voicemail. However, I was aware that he had heard it. The silence conveyed more than words could. I visited the bank independently later that week. I did not do so because it was necessary. Rather, I wanted to inspect the teller's face when I requested confirmation of account control. She gazed at the screen, then at me, and then nodded. I continued to be the sole authorized individual. Continued to be the individual who determined the subsequent course of action. The slip was folded and placed in my coat pocket as I exited. Despite the fact that it was merely a piece of paper, my hand remained firmly gripped on it throughout the entire journey home, as if it were in danger of floating away if I released it. I sipped tea at the kitchen table that evening. All lights are turned off, with the exception of the stove light. The street remained tranquil from the outside. My thorax no longer felt constricted. I had refrained from raising my voice, had not started a commotion. Nevertheless, he was unable to access the possessions that he believed were already his. I had reclaimed what was always mine. The call was received via the apartment intercom in the late morning of Wednesday. The buzzer sounded as I was folding linens on the living room settee. It astonished me more than it ought to have. I cleaned my hands and depressed the button. The courier service's enormous envelope was delivered by the delivery man. No return address is provided. The label contains only my name, which is cleanly typed. I signed the document without solicitation and brought it indoors. Prior to opening it, I was already aware of its nature. A duplicate of the letter that Darren had submitted to the Legal Review Board was enclosed. It was defensive, containing lengthy paragraphs regarding miscommunication, misunderstanding, and the misallocation of responsibility. He asserted that I had forgotten our conversations, accused me of having a misunderstanding of the timelines. I asserted that I had been experiencing a decline for an extended period. There was no contrition, rather a series of meticulous justifications were provided. He never employed the term forgery. He never acknowledged the letter that he had fabricated. Instead, he created a portrait of himself as a son who was apprehensive and endeavoring to do the right thing. A second document, a signed affidavit from a family physician whom I had not seen in 3 years, was enclosed. The date had been modified. The evaluation is ambiguous. In no instance was incompetence mentioned. Rather, it was a mere observation regarding stress, aging, and neglect. Words that could be bent in any direction. I placed the documents aside. My palms did not tremble. I had already acquired an understanding of the sensation of being silently obliterated. The letter was not the only thing that remained with me. It was what I discovered later that afternoon. I had ventured outside to purchase items such as milk, bread, and pears. Upon my return, my voicemail light was rapidly flickering. There are 2 communications. The initial correspondence was from the clinic, which verified my forthcoming physical. The second was from Emily. Compared to my recollection, her voice was more reserved and lower in volume. She stated that she had heard certain statements. I was uncertain as to the nature of the situation. However, I would like to extend a brief greeting. Greetings, nothing more. There was no contact number provided by her. She did not specify her lodging location. She recently expressed her desire for the pastries that I used to prepare. Afterward, the call was terminated. It did not resemble a message that she was intended to transmit. It resembled a murmur that she uttered in the absence of others in the room. I sat at the edge of the kitchen chair with one hand still holding a grocery bag and allowed her voice to play twice. Then I deleted it. Not out of wrath, but rather from a more profound source. Assuming she was not contacting me, she was requesting a version of me that had been rendered distant. She was not yet in possession of all the information. She was, however, beginning to detect fissures. I resumed the process of unpacking the supplies. Placed the fruits in the basin located on the counter. Bread is stored in the drawer. Milk is stored in the refrigerator. The universe had not ceased to exist. However, it had undergone a modest, understated transformation. The type of change that is only apparent when the stillness begins to swell in an unfavorable direction. In that silence, I comprehended. He was no longer in charge. However, it had not yet occurred to him. Kendrick proposed that we reconvene in person. He stated that there was a message he wished to convey to me, but he was hesitant to do so over the phone. We convened at a diner located off Union Street, the type with waiters who never recorded anything and broken leather booths. The door was my view as I arrived early. Kendrick arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a manila folder and appearing more fatigued than usual. He took a seat across from me, ordered a black coffee, and refrained from engaging in idle talk. He placed the folder on the table and opened it. Numerous communications were printed within. The majority of the correspondence was from Darren. A few were from an individual at the bank, and one was from a barrister whose name I did not recognize. Access, leverage, and strategy were the common themes that they all discussed. One in particular was touched by Kendrick. It was dated 2 weeks prior to the phone call regarding Emily's soiree. Darren devised a strategy to temporarily isolate me in it. There is no explicit language, only covert language. Words such as compliance, streamlining, and transition management. He had been formulating it for some time. I was not merely expecting that I would diminish, rather, I was actively establishing it. The invitation, the railway terminus, the time, none of it was an accident. While I read, Kendrick leant back. He refrained from interfering, refused to compromise the truth. I closed the folder and allowed my hands to rest on it. They experienced an increased sense of weight, which was not due to trauma, but rather to a newfound understanding. Kendrick was requested to inform me of the subsequent events. He declared that the bank's internal evaluation had been finalized. The signatures were inconsistent. The attempt to access funds without authorization was recorded. Unless I submitted a formal complaint, there would be no legal action. Nothing was said by me. I simply nodded. He also mentioned that a second financial institution had contacted him and that Darren had attempted to transfer assets using the credentials of his own firm. Now, that action was indicated. I allowed the words to settle in my chest. They did not strike with the force of betrayal. Like confirmation, they arrived. I was aware. I simply had not observed all of the borders. The waitress replenished our glasses while we sat in silence. Kendrick eventually arose, handed me the folder, and instructed me to take my time. There was no urgency. There is no deadline. The truth was waiting for me to use it when I was ready. The folder was wedged against my chest under my outerwear as I walked home. It was the coldest the air had been in days. I did not object. I positioned the folder on the counter at home. I have yet to reopen it. I stood for a brief period, my coat still on, my gaze fixed on the window where the light was beginning to diminish. He executed each maneuver with the assurance of an individual who was certain that no one was watching. However, I had observed an amount that was sufficient. I am currently in possession of the final component, the one he neglected to mention that I still possessed. Just after 6, the doorbell rang, not excessively noisy. 3 brief taps similar to an individual evaluating the weight of their own presence. I remained seated on the settee with the exception of the light above the basin, which was turned off. I observed him, Darren, through the peephole. With his phone in hand, his shoulders were squared and his suit jacket was slightly creased, as if he were about to deliver a presentation. Just for an instant, I observed. Allow the silence to occupy the space between my chest and the door. He struck again, this time with a gentler force. Then awaited. I refrained from migrating. Subsequently, I detected his exhale. After shifting from one foot to the other, he reached into his coat pocket and extracted an envelope. Slide it beneath the door. Silence ensued. No farewell. The hall was devoid of any footfall. Silence. I waited for a full 10 minutes before retrieving it. A letter, handwritten and meticulously spaced, was enclosed. The type of letter that individuals compose when they believe they have exhausted all other potential alternatives. He acknowledged that he had made errors in his writing, that he had exceeded his bounds. He believed that he was safeguarding me from the stress of financial hardship, the perplexity of the future, and the responsibility of control. He never acknowledged his actions, rather, he circumvented them. Language that is both orderly and distant. He requested to meet. He expressed his desire to engage in a conversation in person, advocated for the necessity of resolving the matter. I folded the letter once, reinserted it into the envelope, and put it into the compartment adjacent to my keys. I had no intention of responding. I proceeded to the notary's office by foot the following morning. Kendrick had already completed the updated documents, which included the complete revocation of Darren's access and the reassignment of a secondary beneficiary. Emily's identity has been temporarily eliminated. Kendrick stated that it was reversible in the event that I would ever decide otherwise. I meticulously signed each page, ensuring that my initials were consistent in the margins. The final form was notarized, and the completed copy was presented to me by the notary. It was not a feeling of retribution. It seemed to serve as a conclusion. I passed a bench in the park on my walk home where I used to linger with Emily when she was young. In the autumn, we would feed the geese and count the number of leaves that turned yellow. I refrained from discontinuing. I simply passed it with my gaze fixed on the ground. Upon my return home, the apartment bore a lightened air. It is not dissimilar, rather it is purer, as silence can only achieve this. I prepared a modest pot of broth that evening, ate in silence at the kitchen table. Lentils, carrots, and rosemary from the windowsill, nothing ostentatious. I neglected to inspect the receptacle. I refrained from inspecting my mobile device. Certain items no longer necessitated verification. I was able to fall asleep without waking up that evening. There were no visions, absence of commotion, only the tranquil atmosphere of a residence that is no longer accompanied by uncertainty. He had finally arrived to see me. However, I no longer required his attention. He had already imparted to me all the knowledge that was required. He provided me with the opportunity to reestablish myself by abandoning me. Grayness prevailed throughout the morning, yet it was not oppressive. Quiet in a manner that facilitated decision-making. I exercised caution when selecting my attire. Slacks. A polished blouse that I had not worn in several months. The necklace that my spouse presented to me on our 30th anniversary, featuring a solitary pearl. It was gentle against my clavicle, reminiscent of a memory that was devoid of negativity. I traveled to the bank by transport, the same branch that Darren employed, the same building in which he had smiled at the manager, passed documents across polished counters, and feigned that none of it was cruel. I entered the building and requested the senior associate, provided my identity, awaited. She emerged within minutes, her hand extended and her smile warm, directed me to a compact office that was adorned with 2 leather chairs and frosted glass. Kendrick's documents had been examined by her. Everything was in its proper location. There are no inquiries, only confirmations are required. I delivered the signed documents, joint access closure, asset consolidation in my name, investment account redirection, elimination of all other signatories. I declined to provide any notifications when she inquired whether I desired to do so. There are no notifications. Warnings are not issued, just a definitive conclusion. She stamped the final page, presented me with a folder containing my updated statements, and expressed her gratitude for my attendance in person. I passed the teller station as I exited. A courteous smile emanated from a young man who was situated behind the glass. I reciprocated with a smile. He evoked memories of a child whom Darren used to coach in Little League. The same stance, the same enthusiastic, tidy appearance. Nevertheless, this individual had not yet acquired the ability to maintain an illusion. The wind had intensified outside. I tightened my coat and held the folder close to my bosom. I halted at the patisserie located at the corner, purchased a solitary apple tart which is still warm. The woman behind the counter meticulously wrapped it and, without prompting, affixed a napkin. I expressed my gratitude to her and proceeded to walk the considerable distance to my residence. I consumed it at the kitchen table, observing the foliage sway in the breeze outside the window. The flavor was refreshing and not overly saccharine. The crust separated effortlessly. I refrained from hastening. I opened a new account at a bank that Emily had never visited and Darren was unaware of. This occurred later that afternoon. It felt as though a new line had been drawn in the sand. To refrain from concealing oneself, simply to commence from my current position. I served myself a glass of iced water that evening, stopped at the sink and gazed down at the street. Several automobiles passed by. The illumination was altered. Life progressed without prompting. He had implemented his strategies. However, the ultimate decision had never been his. And at this point there was nothing more to be taken, only what I had elected to retain. A week has elapsed. Please refrain from making any further calls. Absence of characters, failure to anticipate any surprises, silence. The type that does not reverberate. It simply subsides. I revisited the bookstore. Ruthie's customary salutation was a simple nod. No inquiries, no mention of the day I arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a trembling voice. She presented me with a cup of tea that was identically acrid. This time I did not object. I had become accustomed to its flavor. I maintained my seat adjacent to the window. I brought a book this time. I selected one independently, one whom I had once cherished but had since forgotten amid the cacophony of every other activity. I read slowly, page by page, as if I were returning to a portion of myself that had patiently awaited. Subsequently, I visited the bazaar, purchased a small wedge of cheese, tomatoes, and fresh basil. It had been some time since I had prepared a genuine meal. I did so that evening. This is for my personal use only and not everyone else's. The kitchen emanated a scent that suggested the onset of a new era, even if it did not yet have a name. I opened the windows prior to retiring for the evening. Allow the frigid air to enter. It emanated a sense of cleanliness, as if it were expelling the final vestiges of him from the walls. The area did not appear to be devoid of any substance. It was a sense of renewal. He slid the old letter he wrote under my door, which I folded and placed in the back of the filing cabinet. Not out of sentimentality, but to serve as a reminder of the extent of my progress. Burning was not necessary for all items. Certain items necessitated storage. I strolled through the neighborhood the following morning. The air was refreshing. The radiance is gentle. I passed the train station, which is the same one where he had left me. However, this time I refrained from stopping. I proceeded to pass it. Persisted. I did not turn back. If this narrative reminded you of a time when you were compelled to reclaim your own power, even in silence, I hope you are aware that you are not alone. At times, it is the most subtle victories that have the most profound impact on us. If you have ever experienced feelings of invisibility, I recognize you. And it is commendable to be recognized for the fortitude that has enabled you to depart without requiring acclaim. If this narrative resonates with you, please do not hesitate to express your opinions, or simply leave a peaceful sentiment in the space provided below.